Well, hello and welcome to the Church Office Podcast. My name is Gavin Smith, and it's a joy to welcome you today to our Admin and Ops podcast. We love talking about the work of ministry behind the scenes, and we love getting special guests on. And today, our topic is Martyn's Law. And as administrators and operations and pastors, you've probably heard a little bit about this in the media. And really grateful to have Danny Webster on. Danny, thanks for joining us this morning.
It's great to be with you.
It's great. And before we get into the topic, and Danny tells us a little bit about himself and the work that he's undertaking with the Evangelical Alliance on this, let me do a big shout out to our sponsors, Church Suite, who are kindly working with us behind the scenes and have sponsored the podcast, making it available to lots of churches for free. And we really appreciate their partnership and work with us. If you've not heard of Church Suite, then this is a really useful piece of software that you can use for your church database, for your rotas, your communications. It's got planning, it's got the room lettings, it's got the flows. There's a whole range of aspects of this software that will be a blessing and save you time and money in the long run in admin and ops. So please consider and check that out at churchsuite.com. Danny, tell us a little bit about yourself first before we get into the topic. Yeah, church-wise and a bit about your work.
Yeah, so I work for the Evangelical Alliance. I lead our advocacy team, which is involved in our engagement in politics, in government, in Westminster, but also in the Welsh Parliament, the Scottish Parliament, the Northern Irish Assembly. We look to represent evangelical Christians into public life, to give them voice, to engage on pieces of legislation that are of particular interest, but also to inform churches about what's going on, and then to speak out into the media about the issues that matter. And I'm part of it. I live in Sutton in South London. I go to a church, Christchurch, London, that has a site down there. Been part of that church in different forms for coming up for 20 years.
Wow, that's great. That's great. And we are so grateful for the Evangelical Alliance, who are working in the background on this Martyn's Law stuff, because lots of people are maybe aware of it, have heard of it, but no one's talking to the government. No one is trying to figure out how this is going to impact churches. But you guys are on the front line of this, and you were saying to me that you've had meetings down in the Home Office and you've been chatting things through. Give us a little bit of background on this. Someone's on the podcast hears this for the first time. Martyn's Law, what on earth is this? And where does it come from?
You're right. This is definitely a less talked about policy issue. So some of the main things we are working on at the moment, assisted suicide is definitely the most talked about. You're hearing an awful lot about that, and we're very much engaged on that. Martyn's Law, or the Terrorism Protection of Premises Bill, to give it its proper title, we are doing a lot of work on, but it's much less noisy. There's much less media chat about it. This law has come about because of the bombing in Manchester, the bombing of Manchester Arena, and particularly the campaign following the death of Martyn Head, and the campaign by his mother to introduce new legislation and new responsibilities on public premises to ensure that users of those venues are safe. This is some legislation that began life under the last government, under the Conservative government. They consulted on it, they proposed some plans for it. And then after the election last year, the Labour government picked it up and said, we are still going to introduce this. We'll talk about some of the changes that have happened in that process. So there's been continuity and cross-party agreement that they will introduce this legislation, which will put new duties and responsibilities on public premises to ensure that their users are kept safe.
Yeah, it is important, isn't it? It's coming from the right place, because there was 22 killed, there were thousands that were impacted, either injured or just impacted by those, what happened there. So it is great for the public, isn't it, that somebody is thinking about this, and obviously, as we start thinking about some of the content of what it is and what's been going on in consultation, they've kind of split it into different categories, haven't they? The kind of standard and the enhanced. Take us through a little bit about that, Danny. What's the kind of the main things that we need to know about here?
Yeah, so for most public premises, there will be three groups of premises. There will be groups that don't have to take any further measures. That will be, and the criteria is the number of people that use that venue. And it doesn't mean, it's not about the capacity, it's about the number of people who could use that, who could be using it. So it's not the average attendance. It's like, actually, over the course of the year, is there an occasion when you have more than 200 people in your premises? And 200 is the first threshold. If you never have more than 200 people in your venue, these proposals will not apply to your venue. If you do, then they will apply in some form. And there is then a group where your attendance is at any point is between 200 and 799.
Yes.
So that's called the standard tier. And then for venues where at some point during the course of the year there are over 800 people, there is an enhanced tier.
Yes.
The thing that makes this more complicated, and you mentioned that we've engaged with the Home Office, there have been a couple of rounds of consultation on this, and the proposals have changed as they've gone on. They lifted the opening threshold from 100 to 200, which was very welcome, because that has brought a lot of churches out of scope. So for a lot of the smallest churches, and even a lot of medium-sized churches, this won't apply to them. And that was a really positive step. The other positive step that they took was to say that any place of worship that is used for a religious act of worship will be, if the principal use is 4 acts of worship, they will be classed as standard tier regardless of the number of people. And that means that even for venues with more than 800 people in regular attendance or attendance at any point, they will still be classed as a standard tier. So a church with 1,000 people or 2,000 people, they will only have the standard tier duties. And that's really important, because the enhanced duties are when this will really start to bite in terms of implication.
And cost as well.
And cost, exactly. So we were really encouraged by that. We'll probably come on to this. We still have some questions about some of the outworkings and some of the practicalities, but we've been encouraged that they have listened. The legislation sets out slightly different criteria for all sorts of different buildings, education, hospitals, but places of worship do have a distinct category, and we're grateful for how the government have engaged around that.
Moving it from where it originally was at 100 would have impacted so many churches across the UK, wouldn't it? But for those who don't get that regular 200, to be exempt, if you like, from having to start to think about this and put these legal implications in place, it is useful. So 200 between, so a church really is going to be classified as a standard tier in this, and we'll have to start to think about it. Churches that are over that and who are, we chatted a little bit about it, wasn't it, where people are hiring out venues, the bigger churches that might have a kind of commercial side of things. That makes some other complications into this, doesn't it, as well?
So most of our engagement recently, as the bill's been going through Parliament, has been to look at what the government had proposed and say that's great, and then say, well, actually, are there circumstances when it's more complicated than that, and venues would be treated as enhanced, even if they are places of worship or churches are using them? And we've made some progress. We're still engaging. And I think there are different categories. So I think for a church that owns their own building and it is really only ever used as a church building for acts of worship, what is said on the face of the bill applies, that regardless of the number of people, it will, if it's less than 200, it won't apply at all. If it's more 200 or more, it will be classed as standard tier. That is good. That is what we think. And then there are different groups of churches that would potentially be treated differently, and we're still trying to work through how all this works. For a church that hires out a premises for a Sunday service, the main thing to note is that in virtually all circumstances, I don't want to say absolutely everyone because it might be a bit more complicated, in virtually all circumstances, the owner or the primary user, leaseholder of that building will be the person responsible. So if it's the school, it is the school who is responsible. If it's a community centre, it is the council or the charity or whoever owns the community centre that's responsible. For schools, they also have an exemption that means regardless of size, they'll be classed as standard tier. So again, if you're a large church meeting in a school, it will likely be a standard tier, but the responsibility will lie on the school, not on you. They may put some additional duties on you as you're renting out to say that you've got to be aware of this, you've got to have this risk assessment in place. And then on commercial venues, this is one of the bits that is interesting that we're still trying to work through. If you're in a commercial venue that is an enhanced venue for other users, it might be a conference center or a hotel, and you meet in there. The owner of that venue, the managers of that venue are the people responsible. So you don't suddenly become responsible for it, but it is possible that they could pass on some responsibilities and duties to you because of their responsibility. So that's just something to work through with the venue that you're hiring from. Actually, what will be the consequences for us when this comes into force? One other thing that's important to note is there will be a 2-year implementation window. So when this passes into law, which will probably be in the next couple of months, it is in its final stages in Parliament, so it passes into law in April or May. It will be April or May 2027 when this comes into force. So there is a significant period of working out actually what this means and how this applies. So people don't, I think for churches, as we said, that for those under 200, there won't be any responsibilities. For those over, there will be some, but there will be 2 years to work this out and make sure things are in place.
Yeah, that's great. And you pick up on some good points there. People who are listening into the podcast who are hiring other venues thinking, what are we going to do? It is their responsibility, as the owner of that, to work that through. And you're right. We may need to expect and plan for some additional costs as this comes in, because there are going to be impacts on people who are hiring out their building, and we can expect probably some costs in this, or you say some more risk assessments or some more thought that goes into how it flows and how it runs on a day.
I think we talked about churches that hire out other venues, i.e. schools or commercial venues. I think the other thing that we are currently exploring is what does it mean for churches that hire out their own venue? So particularly large church venues that do have a capacity of over 800. If they are regularly hiring out their venue for commercial activities, for entertainment activities, what is the impact of this? And where we have got to at the Home Office is they keep on coming back to the phrasing in the bill about the principal use. And it's what is the principal use of the premises? If its principal use is as a place of worship, it is a place of worship. If its principal use is as a commercial venue used by people hiring it out, then potentially it could be classified as an enhanced venue and the responsibilities on that. And those responsibilities would potentially apply to your activities as a church because the venue is classified, not the activity. So once the venue becomes classified as an enhanced premises, it is an enhanced premises for its use. So I think that's just one thing. I don't think that's going to apply to many churches. But there are some circumstances that we are exploring where churches do hire out their venue a lot for uses that would be not places of worship, it wouldn't be exempt. So there are some of those scenarios. I want to say that this is a tiny minority of churches, but it is something that we're exploring and we're working through at present.
I think you're right, isn't it? 800 to be, renting out your building for conferences and stuff like that is quite significant. And in a sense, the world has changed, isn't it, in terms of how people gather together for training and what you might expect previously. We've noticed churches that are doing less on this whole conference front at that kind of 800 plus level. But it's really interesting, isn't it? Because there's probably lots of Christian organizations who are running residential centers, who have huge capacities with schools and various other things coming in, who are going to be impacted by this then.
So I think for most churches, the application will either be, they won't have to because they're under 200, or it will be fairly light touch. We'll probably come on to what is likely to be in the requirements. I think for some of the Christian ministries and organizations, this is where we are trying to work out how it applies because the exemption is for places of worship. And sometimes conversations with civil servants, when you try and talk about the actual dynamics of how churches work or how Christian organizations work, is difficult
Yeah,
because their understanding and their conception of a church is very much on a classic Church of England,
yeah,
physical church building with Sunday services and maybe some
mm,
other services
mm,
in a certain type. And we're
yeah,
trying to help them understand that actually church life is much wider and
yeah,
much
yeah,
broader than that.
yeah,
I think for Christian residential centres, there are some particular challenges that we've been exploring. I think for big Christian events, there are some challenges. And
yeah,
that's one of the things. I think if you are holding a big event at a commercial premises, whether it's a conference
mhm,
centre or
mhm,
a holiday park, the responsibility lies on that. So
on them. Yeah,
whether it's Spring Harvest or the FIAC
yeah,
Leaders Conference, they operate at commercial venues. So
yeah, yeah,
they're the ones responsible. I
yeah,
think if it is on your private land or on land that is only used for this purpose, um,
mm,
these would apply. So there are
yeah,
Christian events and festivals
yeah,
that are likely to
yeah,
have to be classed as enhanced.
yeah,
Um, I also think there's a bit of realism required that actually a large Christian event with 10,000 people shouldn't be treated differently to a non-Christian event with
yeah,
10,000 people.
yeah,
It
yeah,
is often Christian activity, it's ministry, there might be worship involved, there might be teaching involved, but actually there are some of the risk factors still existent.
yes,
So we
yeah,
do need to be aware that we shouldn't try and be exempt just because it's a Christian event.
yeah,
So it's
yeah, yeah, yeah,
being reasonable about it. We
yeah,
want
yeah,
we want our events to be accessible, we want them to be manageable, but actually the legislation is in place for a reason, and we want
yeah.
to pay attention to that as
Yeah, we
well.
do. We want to run safe events, don't we? That protect people and care for people. Absolutely right. That is the gospel. Um, so in terms of let's look into the standard duty then, and churches who are listening to this going, okay, well we're over 200. What might they expect? And I guess that isn't clear in the guidelines yet, is it? In terms of what it is, what are you anticipating that this could look like realistically?
Yeah. So the intent of the government is that the standard tier requirements are not overly onerous,
Okay.
that there is some responsibility. Um, Standard tier premises will have to notify the regulator, which will be the Security Industry Agency, I
Authority,
think.
the IA,
The,
the SIA, is it?
the
I think that's right,
SIA,
isn't it? Yeah.
the
Okay then.
Security Industry Authority.
Yeah.
They will be taking on responsibility for this, so you have to notify them that you
Yeah.
are a premises that this applies to. And the law talks about putting in place appropriate and reasonably practical public protection procedures.
Yeah.
It is likely that these are not physical measures.
Hmm.
It is more likely that these are around policies and procedures
Yeah.
and staff training
Yeah.
to ensure that people are aware of some of the risks, are
Yes.
aware of what needs to be done. But it is for standard tier, it is not anticipated that this will involve things like security guards, bag
Yeah.
searches,
Yeah.
additional CCTV. It is about risk assessments and policies and
Yeah. Yeah.
procedures and
Yeah.
training.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that should be realistic.
Yeah.
And I think there will be consultations
Yes.
as the guidelines are worked out. After the bill passes into law, they will look at the application of this and how this works in practice.
Yeah.
Um, but I think, and so the final details will be ironed out in those guidelines. But I think the expectation is that it is around the area of policies, procedures, training, risk assessments,
Yeah.
rather than practical measures.
Yeah, and I think that's right, isn't it? There's some of the stuff I've read, and people starting to try and anticipate what the government might expect and that policy and procedure might look like. Is things like an INVAC or an XVAC, and some of the stuff we're doing around fire procedures anyway of evacuating the building. There's going to be similar kind of procedures in place where we have to exit the building, make sure
Yeah.
everybody is out. But some of the stuff that I've read on the INVAC stuff is locking down sections of the building, and obviously, we need to begin to start to kind of think about that, which to be honest, lots of churches wouldn't have a great deal of experience in doing.
Yeah, and
Um,
this is one of the things that actually there may well be some stuff to look at over the next 2 years as this
mm,
is implemented to say, well, actually, are there some areas where churches need some training
yeah,
to say what is an INVAC or an XVAC policy? What does
yeah,
this look like? How can you apply this in your context?
yeah,
Um, so I think there is some stuff that churches are going
yeah,
to need to learn and to engage with. But I think my primary thing is just don't be scared by it. Don't
Yeah.
be overly worried by it.
Yeah.
There will be a bit of work to do, but it should be manageable.
Yeah, absolutely right. And so hear this: if if you're less than 200, then you can say, "Oh, hallelujah!" We don't have to do anything. We rejoice. If you're in 200, then okay, yeah. Of the next few years, as this policy stuff comes into play, and that there's a greater clarity in what we need to do, then we need to start to begin to implement this. And if you're in admin and ops, this is probably going to land on your desk at some point, and you're going to need to take some action to do that. And it's great that we do have this kind of 24 hour 24 months implementation period where we can begin to look at that. Is this a new regulatory body that's being set up, Danny?
So they do exist. This is the
It does
agency
exist.
that they exist already. They regulate security guards
Okay.
for the security industry. So they are just being given this additional responsibility.
Yeah.
And the expectation is that they will inspect premises.
Okay.
Um, but the frequency of that, the regularity of that, I suspect they would focus on enhanced duty premises over
Yeah.
standard duty. Um, so they will be given some powers,
Yeah.
but again, exactly the process of inspection and what that looks like in
Yeah.
practice is the
Yeah.
sort of thing that we're still
Yeah.
to work
Yeah.
out how that works. It's worth saying that although we think that the enhanced duty will not apply to virtually any churches,
Hmm.
and I think it will only apply to a small number of kind of residential centres or events. And I think it
Hmm.
probably will in
Yeah.
a small number of
Yeah.
cases. This is where there will be a duty and a responsibility to take action and to take measures to put public protection measures in
Yes.
place. That might be to do with CCTV, that might be to do with bag searches or security. They will also be required to document those measures and what they're
Yeah.
doing
Yeah.
and how that is
Yes. Yeah.
helping to
Yeah.
fight safety. So I think there will be a small number of organisations that do have to up their game and work out, well, what
Yeah.
does this look like in practice? And there will
Yes.
be cost implications
Yeah.
of this. As I say, I think it will be a small number of residential centres, a small number of Christian events that operate on
Yeah.
their own
Yeah.
sites. One other thing that we are encouraged by is that this will not affect open air public events.
Okay. Okay.
Um, so this is one of the things we're exploring. It will affect ticketed events.
Okay.
So whether it's free or paid for, if it's ticketed, and basically if there's a way of actually telling who's in and who's not,
Hmm.
this will affect it. But if it's an open air evangelistic event, or if you're holding an Easter service in the
Yeah.
park, or
Yeah.
a
On the
Good
beach
Friday,
or things like that.
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
or
Yeah.
Good
All sorts
Friday
of
walk
kind of
of
stuff.
witness, you'll still probably have some work to do with the council on permissions and things that
Yeah.
you already have to do, but it is ticketed events that this applies to.
Okay.
And we were encouraged by that clarification.
Yeah, that's useful. That's useful. And I think, hopefully this podcast will be, put this subject on people's radar. Let's plan in our budgets to think about how we might need to train staff and volunteers. We don't want to just be, get to the last month of the implementation and go, oh, what do we need to do? We're getting ahead of the game here. This is legislation that's going to come into power in the next couple of months. We're going to have 24 months to put stuff in. You're right. We don't need a panic. We don't, there's a measured approach that we need to take. Put some money in the budget for training. Start to explore this. And what I found in lots of churches, Danny, is there are people with good common sense that have got experience in this, and say to people, don't try and do this on your own. Do you know what I mean? Draw in some other people, learn from chatting to other churches. What things have you put in place? What have you found useful? And we've started a conversation with some of our police officers in the church who've got great experience of this, and saying, could we put together like a security team that runs on a Sunday, that's light touch, that begins to start to think about some of this, and not a visible presence, not bag searching or anything like that, but just to begin to say, actually, let's get people thinking about this. And on our website, there is a kind of a security, if you like, role description that we've put together that we've been trying to put into place in the church for the last sort of few years, starting to think about this. And that might be useful for you to just have a little look at and say, actually, is this something that we need in the church? But that is at the other, the larger end of this application. Danny, anything else that you think, advice for churches that we haven't covered that, in this area?
I think we've covered a lot of it. I think I would encourage churches to be thinking about this. I think if churches have got questions that they're like, well, actually, how would this apply to me? They can get in touch with us. Probably the best contact address is just advocacy at eauk.org. If you've got a scenario that you think is complicated, we want to hear about it, because those are the scenarios that we are talking to the Home Office about. They're the ones that we're saying, how about this? How about that? And there will be some consultations on the implementation, and there will be opportunities to engage with that. And we'll be producing more detailed information once we do have a clear idea of exactly what the responsibilities for the different levels will be, because this is something that churches do need to pay attention to, and we want to find the right balance between reassuring churches that actually in most cases it will either be none or minimal, but also equipping churches to ensure that they are able to engage with it and do know what they need to do.
Yeah, Danny, that's great, and we appreciate all the work that EA are doing on this, and like I said, there are a few people that are really engaging with the government about this and caring for the church, not just your own denominational group and those churches that are partnering with you, but a wider, independent churches who are going to listen to this and be helped. So, mate, thanks for putting the time in and the effort in and all that you guys are doing on that. They might not be grateful for it now, but they will be later.
No, thank you.
They get clarity. So thanks for that, what you're doing. And like Danny says, if you've got any questions, please get in contact with them directly. If you want to run things through us and you want to do that, please, questions at thechurchoffice.co.uk. If we thought there was enough people to, as the legislation gets closer, that we could think, right, let's organize a group Zoom of leaders and people who want to ask further questions as stuff becomes more apparent of what the regulations need to be put in place. Then we'll look to do that and look to connect and partner together to serve you as a church. But like you say, this is a really helpful conversation, Danny. Thanks for giving up your time to jump on the podcast and serve us, mate. And great to have you on.
Great to talk to you and great to be of service.
It's great. And in the show notes, I'll link through to some of the previous articles that you've already written on the EA site that just gives people a little bit of background, and we'll also link through the fact sheet that the government have produced, just to help people build up their knowledge, and as leaders begin to ask more questions, let's prepare ourselves in a real understanding of this to serve people in our church, which will be great. So thank you today for connecting on the podcast. We've got 95 podcasts. I counted them last night thinking, how on earth have we got to this number? Talking about all different areas, whether it be finance, whether it be policy, whether it be volunteers, staffing. There's a whole range of things. So please check out. There may be something that might be of use to you and serve you in your local church. So thank you for your time, Danny, and we'll see you again on the podcast. Goodbye.